Hey y'all, it's Mr. Delott again. We're just going to finish talking about a couple of things for AP World History. Finishing up the terms of the Treaty of Nanking real quick after the Opium War between Britain and China, and then we'll get into economic imperialism in Africa. So here we go. So the last thing, really quickly, that we didn't quite get to with the Treaty of Nanking is one of the things that China had to do was grant Britain what was called most favored nation status for trade, which meant that basically all other nations' trade rights in China were automatically given to the British as well. So if China made a treaty with France or Russia or Germany or anyone like that gave them some sort of new trade right, because Britain had most favored nation status, they would automatically get that same right that the other country had. And that's just a result of Britain winning this Opium War against the Chinese. And that goes along with extraterritoriality and the fact that Britain gets Hong Kong and the other humiliating terms of this treaty. Right? China considers these to be the unequal treaties, which they definitely were. And remember, too, that this is the beginning of the century of humiliation for China, because they're dominated by European powers and Japan for basically 100 years. Anyway, there is also a second Opium War from 1856 to 1860 that's a little bit less impactful, but Britain and France together inflict yet another humiliating defeat on the Qing dynasty. And this time they make a treaty called the Treaty of Tientsin, which just opens even more new ports in China. It does, however, officially make opium legal in China, which allows Britain and France to bring in even more. And it also guarantees freedom of movement within China for Christian missionaries and Western diplomats, and just kind of increases European control in China. And speaking of European control, what ultimately results from all this is European spheres of influence in China. If you remember, this is essentially just a zone, a region in China where the Western country gets exclusive trade rights or economic rights over that particular part of China. And Japan, France, Germany, Russia, and the United States are all going to seek equal rights with Britain as far as Chinese trade goes. And these spheres of influence are going to force further unequal treaties. These countries are going to force further unequal treaties on China. They're going to gain these spheres of influence. And essentially what happens is the U.S. is looking around watching this going on, and they realize that Japan and these European countries are all trying to lock down Chinese trade, right? And you probably remember this from American history, but the U.S. doesn't want to be locked out of China. So what happens is McKinley's Secretary of State John Hay issues the open door notes essentially to Japan and the rest of Europe, and tells them that the door to Chinese trade has to remain open to the U.S. So it's called the open door policy because it guarantees Chinese trade would stay open to the U.S. and all Western countries. Now, there's a couple of things that go on with this. So John Hay specifically says he wants to stop Europe from carving China like a melon. And so part of the open door notes are also that the U.S. Tries to guarantee the territorial integrity of Qing Dynasty China. They don't want Britain or anybody else to officially take possession of Chinese territory other than Hong Kong. Anyway, that'll finish us up with economic imperialism in Asia. So moving on to economic imperialism in Africa. We've talked a lot about imperialism in Africa, so a lot of this you've already heard, but just to put it all in one place with economic imperialism and why Europeans are in Africa and how they're trying to make money. Obviously, cash crops play a huge role in this. We've talked about several cash crops in Africa that the Europeans are basically forcing everybody there to grow. And so there's that big shift from subsistence farming of food in Africa to commercial farming, mostly for, again, cash crops. The Europeans are wanting them to grow for European markets, whether we're talking about raw cotton in Egypt or rubber in the Congo. It's all for British industrialization. They got to feed the factories. And what we see is Europeans continue to trade mostly the same goods in Africa in exchange for all this African produce, right? They're trading weapons, European textiles, canned food, alcohol. It's very similar to what's been traded in Africa for centuries at this point by Europeans. And if you remember the concept of monocultures with agriculture, that also happens in Africa. And that reliance on a single cash crop, along with all the environmental damage that it could potentially cause, it leaves a lot of African countries particularly vulnerable to drought, to famine, right? Because one, focus on cash crops means there's not enough food crops anyway, and then that one cash crop, if it gets hit by some sort of pest or some sort of disease and it gets wiped out, that's pretty much it for that entire region's economy. And like I say, cash crops are more profitable as long as you keep them alive, and so food production goes down, especially because the best land tends to be reserved for the most valuable crops, and those tended to be cotton and rubber, which are both inedible. And so that means that the food you are growing is on poor soil a lot of the time, which again decreases food production. But anyway, to quickly get into a couple of specifics with this, I've mentioned Egyptian cotton several times and how Egypt is still famous for its cotton, but the thing that really lets Egypt take off with cotton production is the American Civil War. The Egyptian cotton industry is going to boom because the American South is, one, busy fighting the North, and two, blockaded by the United States. And so there is no American cotton really being exported to Europe at all between 1861 and 1865. And so Egypt really manages to take advantage of that, and they double their cotton production from 1861 to 1863. And by 1900, 93% of all the Egyptian government's money comes from cotton, which is almost entirely exported to Britain because they're turning that raw Egyptian cotton into British finished textile goods. And because of the success of the Egyptian cotton growing industry, other areas in British East Africa are going to try to grow cotton as well, especially because the British try to encourage places like Sudan and Uganda to replace any of their older cash crops and food crops with cotton growth. And the result here is that cotton kind of becomes the major export from Uganda, Sudan, Egypt, most of East Africa. It replaces all the old resources like ivory, even slaves become less important, which is kind of hand in hand with an increase in cotton production and the end of the slave trade by the British. And one system that we see for cotton production and profit in Sudan specifically is going to be something called the Plantation Syndicate, which was basically a cartel of British weaving companies that totally controlled cotton production and labor in Sudan, which is just another way that they exploited the local Sudanese population into essentially economic slavery to make them grow cotton for the British. Now, moving south a little bit from Sudan and Egypt is Kenya, which traditionally Kenya's economy had been based around herding, mostly cows. But with the arrival of the British and cash crops and everything, those traditional herding, grazing animals get pushed off of all the good soil because they need to make room for the cash crops, right? And a lot of them end up having to relocate because the government gives all the fertile land to white settlers especially, but any cash crop farmers in Africa's Rift Valley, which is pretty good for growing crops and everything, but that means that the herders that are producing the food that their entire way of life is based around, they take a big hit because their soil and their grazing land is just not good quality. And especially once these people start to run out of food and everything, they get forced into poverty, and a lot of Kenyans end up being forced to provide cheap labor on British plantations. It's similar to other places we've seen, like the Dutch with the corvée system, but it's basically that they don't have a choice. It's economically coercing these people into labor on these cash crop plus tax plantations. And to kind of make sure this is going on, the British even had laws that prohibited any African farmers from exporting cash crops on their own. And some places in British East Africa and other European colonies as well had laws that kept the natives from growing any cash crops at all. Like tea and coffee, it was illegal to grow tea or coffee unless you were a white British settler. And that just strengthens the British chokehold on all these crops. Now, on the Gold Coast, the region that historically had provided so much of African gold in trade to the rest of the world, gold still matters. Obviously, it's money in the ground waiting for you to come grab it. But a major cash crop that pops up there is cocoa. And the missionaries had brought it with them in the 1880s from South America and introduced it in West Africa, which rapidly becomes the largest cocoa producing region in the world. Nigeria, Ivory Coast, Angola, and Sao Tome are also going to join in on this cocoa production, which still today a huge proportion of the chocolate grown in the world comes from this region. And of course, cocoa and cotton and rubber aren't the only cash crops. Palm oil is still a huge one. Even today, about a third of all the vegetable oil in the world comes from oil palms. And we've already covered all the deforestation and environmental impact of this, but they want palm oil and palm kernels for their oils, right? Industrial lubricants to keep the factory machinery running smoothly, and you can use it for plenty of other things as well, like cooking, candle making, etc. And like I said previously, palm oil and cocoa production are still two of the harshest industries in the world, particularly with cocoa. And even now, major companies like Nestle, Hershey, still buy most of their chocolate from other companies and from producers that use at least partially slave labor to grow the chocolate, right? And while we're on the subject of slavery, just to finish out the video for today, remember that by the second half of the 1800s, slavery is certainly on the way out worldwide. It doesn't ever totally end. Again, even today in 2022, there's still some slavery in the world. But following Britain's lead, the world tends to start moving away from slave labor as its main source of labor by the end of the 1800s. Remember, Britain outlaws the slave trade along with the United States in the early 1810s. Actually, it's actually before that, 1807, 1808. And then they outlaw slavery itself in all British territory by 1833. But slavery did still exist in other places. Non-British countries are all a little bit slower than Britain. South American countries are the slowest to officially ban slavery. But for example, in France, the army used slaves as payment for African troops. Like African troops that fought for France would be straight up paid in people. And a lot of government workers and other people that worked for France in their colonies tended to be slaves. And slavery in Africa as a whole continues until the early 1900s, with slave raiding, slave trading continuing until basically 1912, when it's finally stamped out in parts that are parts of Africa affiliated with Belgium and Portugal. And so it takes a very long time to finally end slavery as a practice in Africa. And that's just for the same reason that slavery was used the entire time. It makes even more money for the people that are using the slave labor. You don't have to pay your workers, you make more cash. And so Belgium, Portugal, and local African leaders continued to do this to produce these industrial cash crops for a really long time. Again, oil palms, coffee, cocoa, doesn't matter. And some companies tried to oppose slave labor for products that they used, but ultimately, especially in the places where there are monopolies on the cocoa production, for example, there might only be one option, especially in the 1800s, to buy cocoa from a company that uses at least partially slave labor. But that said, there were plenty of people who didn't buy anything from or affiliate with slave-using companies, like Cadbury's, like the Easter egg people. Cadbury's were run by a bunch of Quakers from up in the northeast of the United States who were vehemently against slavery on moral and religious grounds. And so Cadbury becomes one of the first companies to straight up stop buying any slave-grown cocoa after 1908. Because in 1908 they find out that the Portuguese are still using slaves to grow cocoa. And so Cadbury's shuts off all of their importation of Portuguese chocolate because the Portuguese were using slaves. And there are a few other companies that follow up after them, like Hershey eventually figures it out and starts to stop buying as much slave-grown chocolate. But there are other companies, again, even now, that don't care. And it's just, personally for me at least, something to consider whenever you buy chocolate for Easter, Halloween, on a daily basis, whatever it is. But all that to say, there is light at the end of the tunnel. Slavery does eventually get stamped out. Like I say, Britain outlaws it in 1833, France outlaws it in 1848. And one thing that gets proven pretty quickly is that even without slavery, cash crops can boom, as they do in the French colonies or in British East Africa. And especially with the essentially mercantilist model that a lot of these colonial powers are using, there's still a lot of money to be made, even if you pay the workers that are growing these crops. And so slavery does eventually peter out or get stamped out by the end of the 1800s, and especially by 1912 in Africa. But anyway, we'll move on with Latin American economic imperialism and wrap that up next time I see y'all.